Hope everyone's doing all right, and that it's not too gloomy or wintry where you are.
Just started raining here just now as you said that, so very gloomy and wintry here.
But this is such an exciting thing to like cheer up the gloom. I'm so ready. I've been waiting for this for like 3 weeks. I cannot wait. I'm so happy. Just a bunch of
I hope to live
queers.
up to those expectations. We'll see.
Oh, you will.
Just a nice reason to gather together and do and think some queer things together.
I'm just gonna keep admitting people in the meantime. But Marcus, do you want to maybe do Zoom conduct before we get started?
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, for coming back, or for attending for the first time if this is your first seminar. Welcome, and we're really happy to have you here with us. So just some admin stuff to start off with. As I'm sure many people are familiar with now, there is or are certain ways or kind of like little techniques or things for doing this kind of Zoom discussion and seminar. So we do invite everyone to be on mute while people are speaking in order to minimize background noise and interference. We also note that this is a kind of queer space and LGBTQ+ friendly space. So to invite people to be aware of both the space they take up when they ask questions and also the way that they kind of frame and interact with the space while they're here. We will be taking questions and having comments and participations a few different ways. So one of those ways is by using the chat function, which is available at the bottom, and you can type in thoughts, comments, questions as the talk is going on. If you would like to pose a question in the discussion part, you can type it there, and me or Eleonora will read that out. You can also use the raise hand function too to ask your questions. That should be available either at the bottom, sometimes it's in the participants bit next to your name in one of those options, or down at the bottom actually in that participants bit, but there are also some shortcuts. So I'm just going to put them in the chat so people can see them. But for Windows, you can use the Alt+Y keyboard shortcut to raise or lower your hand. And for Mac, you can use the Option+Y keyboard to raise and lower your hand. We're really excited to have Ella Haselswerdt with us here today to talk about Sappho, and I'll hand over to Eleonora to do the introduction.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, it's great to have people back and to have such a wonderful speaker today. So I'm just gonna introduce her. Ella Haselswerdt received her PhD from Princeton University in 2018, and after a stint as a postdoctoral associate in the Cornell Classics department, recently joined the faculty at UCLA Classics as an assistant professor. So her work has focused predominantly on Greek tragedy, but she has published on the sound and sublimity on the Oedipus Cercolanus, and ongoing projects on tragedy include an article on the Philoctetes that explores the relationship between the Eros suffering and Lemnos mythic landscape, a queer reading of the chorus at Iphigenia and Aulis, and a monograph entitled Epistemologies of Suffering, Tragedy, Trauma, and the Choral Subject. She's also published on dreams and the body in ancient medicine, and maintains an interest in a variety of areas of reception, including Brazilian performance and contemporary poetry. And her talk today, which I have to say, when I first read the title, I was so excited for this week to come, is Sappho's Body Towards a Deep Les Philology. And I'm just gonna hand it over to her now.
Great, thank you so much. So here, I guess before I get started, so I need my host disabled participant screen sharing. So if we could get the screen sharing going, that would be great. But while we're working on that, I first wanted to offer really deep thanks to Marcus and Eleonora. I haven't been able to attend all of these sessions, but I've been able to pop in for a few, and like such a sort of wonderful, open, interesting space doesn't occur by accident. That takes a lot of work and thoughtfulness. And it's really a testament to their vision and their follow through. So that first of all. And then a quick plug. So the UCLA Classics Department is accepting applications for the PhD program for students to begin in fall 2021. We're very enthusiastic about soliciting these applications. If there's anything you want to know about that you can't learn from Google, you can get in touch with me or with Francesca Martelli, who's the DGS. And then finally, before I kind of dive in, I want you to feel free to be really active in the chat. I'm not going to monitor it while I'm talking, but I think Marcus and Eleonora will. And I really think that, there are so many things that are not great about being a part like this. And so I think taking advantage of the few things that are actually really cool, like I think having a little kind of chorus or peanut gallery going to kind of keep yourselves entertained while I'm blathering on is really a great thing. So please feel free to any kinds of comments or questions or whatever, don't be shy in the chat. And so as I think will be very clear, I've tried to frame this really as a speculative project. It's one that I welcome feedback on. I hesitate to even call it a work in progress, as I'm not sure what it will progress to or if it will progress at all. I was very intentional in my preposition choice in the title of this talk. So I hope that this work will bring us towards something. It certainly doesn't bring us all the way there. And a little bit of a personal note. So I was able to make it to the first half of the first session of the seminar series. And I've been thinking a lot about the kind of initial survey questions that Sebastian Metzner posed. And the first two were, do you identify as queer and do you identify as a classicist? Those were very easy for me to answer in the affirmative. But the third question was whether classics was important to the development of my queer identity or something along those lines. And I initially clicked no when I answered that question. And why did I click no? So I had always, for most of my life, pretty emphatically thought of my work as separate from my identity. I knew that I loved Sappho. I have a tattoo from Fragment 31. But I kind of thought that was something that was between me and Sappho, if you know what I mean. It wasn't really relevant to the sort of literary analysis that drew me into the field. And probably some extent, this was a fear of being pigeonholed or some degree of internalized homophobia or misogyny. And questions of gender and sexuality never really came up in my work until 2016, as I was nearing the end of my graduate studies. And I reached a sort of boiling point as I felt that my and others' personal connection to Sappho was being devalued by experts in my field. And in sort of a fit of pique that was precipitated also by the political climate, I wrote the Eidolon essay that I sent a link around to. And once I'd submitted it, I really thought that I had kind of gotten it out of my system and said all that I cared to say about the topic. But for various reasons, including the fact that that piece seemed to touch a nerve, over the last few years, I found myself increasingly interested in the ways that queer studies and the classics can inform one another. And on a psychic level, I do think that it has been healing and meaningful for me to integrate these aspects of my identity, even though I've very happily identified as a queer and somewhat happily as a classicist for my entire adult life. So that is to say, while I first clicked no on Sebastian's survey, after a few seconds of reflection, I changed my mind and clicked yes, because identity formation is something that continues well into adulthood. And one important takeaway here, I think, for me at least, is how powerful platforms can be in creating the kind of work that we want to see in the world, at least for suggestible people like me. So if Eidolon hadn't existed, I never would have written that essay. And what I'm presenting here today is very particular to the kind of space and proposal that Marcus and Eleonora put forward. And this is, I think, something for everyone to think about, given the recent shuttering of Eidolon in particular. Okay, so now I will try to share my screen. Okay, how's that look? Can people see? Okay, awesome. So kind of starting with a very brief lesbian critique of philology. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on critique today. I'd rather focus our energies on building something positive. But I thought it was worth taking a few minutes to discuss what I mean when I say that I think that there's room and a need for a situated, critical, lesbian, or as I'll elucidate, deep les philology. And I'm just going to pull out 3 quick case studies ranging from the early 19th century, the origins of modern philology, up until today, that each highlight different aspects of the way that misogyny and homophobia, broadly construed, can yield outcomes that are both harms to the living and that distort the past. And so I'll start very briefly back in 1816 with Friedrich Gottlieb Welcker, who developed an approach to analyzing ancient testimonia that shares methodological principles with practices of textual criticism that continue today, principles grounded in the natural sciences and genealogy. By using a scientific eye, one could comb through dubious citations and imitations to uncover the truest, purest, oldest version of a story. Welcker developed this method with a particular goal in mind: to rescue Sappho from the suggestion that she had sexual relations with either men or women. All of the testimony about her lasciviousness was attributed to a dark doppelganger, a shadow Sappho as prostitute, a defiled and abject figure who could easily be discarded. Via the application of his entirely neutral and objective scientific method, he was able to deliver the very thing that he fervently desired: a chaste and pious Sappho, abstracted from her body, a schoolmistress who admired her students but lusted after nobody. Skipping ahead to 1970. On the other side of the debate, we have George Devereux making a philological argument in Classical Quarterly, proposing to reappraise the nature of Sappho's seizure, to demonstrate that it constitutes proof positive of her lesbianism, and to delimit on the basis of psychophysiological considerations, since any emendation of eage must have, if it is to match the clinical precision and to fit the rest of the seizure she describes.
So sorry to interrupt, Ella. It's just a little bit zoomed in, the image that we're seeing of your screen. So we're getting quite, I don't know if that's intentional.
Interesting. Is this any better?
That looks great.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. The problem is that now I can't see my script.
Okay.
Wait, let's see. Does it still look okay?
That looks great to me.
Okay, how about now?
As well.
Good?
We're just slightly missing the bottom, but I think we've got like the majority of the image.
Okay.
Wait, no, that could be, that's great.
Okay, all right.
Perfect.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank
Sorry.
you. No, thank you. So, and this quote he gives is, the core of the problem can best be stated in somewhat colloquial terms. And this is him, he's making an argument, this is a philological argument about whether eage for the tongue breaks should be amended. What does this man, and indeed any man, have that Sappho does not have? What can a man offer to a girl that Sappho cannot offer? The answer, I think, is obvious and leads to a clinically highly documentable and crucial finding. Few women are as obsessed with a neurotic feeling of incompleteness with the clinically commonplace female castration complex as the masculine lesbian. Moreover, the latter experiences her defect with violent and crushing intensity, particularly when her girlfriend is taken away from her, not by another lesbian, but by a man who has what she does not have and which she would give her life to have. So this is a very extreme example about how a set of preconceptions can be leveraged into a particular philological argument. Usually the mechanics of this are much more subtle, and there's a few examples of this in the Eidolon piece. But the point is that when the discipline is created, shaped, and practiced predominantly by straight white men for centuries, it is inevitable that it will be saturated with inherent biases. Finally, I want to mention, again, only very briefly, the recent slow-boiling scandal of the newest Sappho papyri. This is a convoluted tale, one that's being followed closely both in the popular press and in academic circles. And I don't need to rehash its twists and turns here. I just want to note that the toxic exclusionary tendencies also color the material practices on which interpretive philology depends, granting an extraordinary amount of control and power to an elite old boys club that seems to have been operating in cahoots with a radically misogynist and homophobic corporation, the proprietors of the Hobby Lobby in the US. So again, most recent work is not quite as overtly offensive as any of these examples. And I should note here that there have, of course, been many powerful feminist interventions in Sappho studies. I'm greatly indebted to the work of scholars like Paige Dubois, Marilyn Skinner, Ellen Green, Ava Stell, Ann Carson, and others. But I've sensed a waning interest in questions of gender and erotics in and around Sappho. And in a way, it's understandable. It's a whole lot of discourse for a few scraps of poetry to bear. But simultaneous to this waning interest within the profession, there has, I think, been a huge amount of popular interest in Sappho, sex, and identity. And I'm going to provide 2 data points here. Neither of them are at all conclusive, but I do think that they're suggestive. Many of you are probably familiar with SapphoBot, which is a great little Twitter account to follow. It just kind of churns out fragments of Sappho from Carson's, if not Winter, translation. And it's got a lot of followers. And all of the posts get a fair amount of engagement, but it's sort of interesting to look through and see what is most popular, or what kind of gets the most action when it's tweeted out by SapphoBot. And this is just from, I kind of randomly went there a couple weeks ago, as you can see, October. And obviously, so whenever there's sort of like some kind of overt homoeroticism, the fragment is going to take off. People really respond to that. This is actually an interesting example, right? So this particular fragment, the word translated as girl here is paidos. And actually, this struck me because if you look in Carson's book, she translates it as boy. And I don't know if the kind of curator, the proprietor of SapphoBot went in and changed it, because I do think that there are various, not going to get into it today, but there are various compelling reasons to think that that is a better reading. But anyway, so that all that is to say that people love gay stuff on SapphoBot. The other very scientific data point is that when I go to Instagram and I search hashtag Sappho, I get 85,500 posts. And most of them are, posts by young queers. And browsing through some of them, so more than once I've seen this. So when a post is about actual specific Sappho content, rather than just, as the kids would say, Sappho as a mood, right? You'll see a kind of muddled argument in the comments about whether Sappho was really a lesbian, or if saying so was by erasure and she was really bisexual. And then a know-it-all, probably a classicist, might come along and explain that neither of these are accurate, as those identities didn't really exist at the time, and it's hard to know anything at all about a figure whom we can only really perceive through her poetry. And of course, all of these views have some validity, either psychically or historically, but none of them ultimately, I think anyway, are terribly satisfying. And what I would really love is for us as a discipline to have something more to offer this kind of conversation. Something that's generous, expansive, and true, that's grounded in our expertise, and something that could better serve a generation of people who are deeply political, fervently invested in questions of identity, and as we've seen happen iteratively for generations, this is something Emily Rutherford put really nicely last week, kind of forever hopeful that the glimpses of familiarity that they see in antiquity are evidence of a yearn for kinship across time. So in this and in other disciplines characterized by a sort of faux neutral view from nowhere, right? A sort of colorless objective perspective. A way to start to correct and undo some of the inherent biases is to establish one's particular partial perspective. And note that this doesn't mean giving up on any claim from truth or kind of dissolving into total relativism. So as Donna Haraway puts it, right, the alternative to relativism is not totalization and single vision, which is always finally the unmarked category whose power depends on systemic narrowing and obscuring. The alternative to relativism is partial, locatable critical knowledges, sustaining the possibility of webs of connections called solidarity in politics and shared conversations in epistemology. And so I'm happy to say that there are others trying to do the work right now of building approaches to philology from the particular embodied perspective of other minority positions. I'm specifically thinking about two excellent recent articles. Patrice Rankine's critique of philology's white supremacist grounding in the classics, race, and community engaged Republic scholarship, 2019 article in AJP, as well as Hannah Silverblank and Marcella Ward's piece, Why Does the Classical Reception Need Disability Studies? Came out very recently in CRJ. And I like to think that the work I'm doing on this topic exists both in conversation and in solidarity with these interventions. So now I'm going to discuss a few sort of entries into the Sapphic archive that I think go some way towards enacting a situated philology of this kind. But first, I'm hoping that you'll accompany me on a little bit of a journey to simultaneously excavate and layer on some feelings, identities, and material practices that draw on Sappho or help explain her powers. Okay, so where are we? I was happy that there was some discussion last week about archives, about their effective impact, particularly for those of us in the queer community, what it's like to see material evidence of queer pasts. And I want to take us today to an archive, one that's situated in a brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn, New York. So this is the Lesbian Her Story Archives, founded in 1974 by Joan Nessel, Deborah Adele, Sahil Cavallo, Pamela Oline, and Julia Penelope Stanley. They were kind of members of an organization called the Gay Academic Union, one of the many gay activist groups of the 60s that was galvanized by the Stonewall riot. This was a small group that felt that there was a good deal of sexism within that group, so they split off to undertake their own project. And the archives host an assortment of items, many shelves of books, photos, magazines, love letters, all types of ephemera. I've been there a couple of times, years ago before I started graduate school, not as a researcher, but as a volunteer, cataloging the ephemera of lesbians who had died and left some of their belongings to the archive, magazine clippings and softball jerseys, that kind of thing. One of the founders said that if a lesbian had touched it, they would collect it. This is a joke, but it's one that channels the kind of haptic and sensual experience of the place, the way that it has been enchanted by the presence and imprint of bodies and subjectivities. This enchantment is then amplified by the caring attention of volunteers and archivists. So this is a permanent installation by the artist Anne Campbell in the archives called Archivist Fingers. So you can see that it's these kind of cast fingers, and they're hooked onto, they're attached to these ladders, which run along the stacks. And this embodies the archive's affective energies. Campbell describes the piece as mimicking both the queer labor and desire that is central to the survival of the place. So I'll also note that Sappho's presence is diffused throughout the archives in various ways. She's lent her name to the titles of many of the books on the shelf, books like My Name is Sappho, Sappho Was a Right-On Woman, etc. The archives hold documentation and records also of the Daughters of Bilitis, an organization of lesbians founded in the 50s, named after Sappho's lesbian lover and the poetry of French poet Pierre Louis in his 1894 work, The Songs of Bilitis. This provided them with some cover. They said, if anybody asked, we could just say we were in a poetry club. One could chart the way that cryptic encoded references to the Isle of Lesbos gave way to an out and proud reclamation of the name. But this isn't a study of Sappho and lesbian identity in the second half of the 20th century, though that would be a really valuable project and somebody should undertake it. Rather, I want to suggest that the idea of the archive is a useful way for thinking about the corpus of Sappho's fragments themselves and their affective excesses. The material scraps of papyri collected by later editors exist as a diffuse archive of materials collected in various editions. But I'm also interested in the ways in which the poems themselves, Sappho's perspective and interests, constitute a sort of collection of ephemera. We might think of Sappho herself as an archivist, a way to balance a rich material approach with an acknowledgement of how much has been lost in life, in love, and in time. She collects people. Several have noted that, as far as we can tell from the small amount of evidence we have, Sappho's poetry was particularly rich in personal pronouns, embodied energies and subjectivities. It was rich in flowers, textiles, feelings, sensations, everything a capital L lesbian touches. And I just have one really tiny example of this here, right? So fragment 125, I used to weave crowns. So we have here the kind of material labor of handicraft imbued with this kind of constant sense of nostalgia and loss, right? Something in the past, but that you can still sort of materially present. And this constant tension between presence and absence is palpable throughout the poems, even those that are, largely intact. If you'll consider with me Sappho 16, a poem I'm sure we all know well. I just want to, I'll read a really quick translation here. So some say a host of cavalry, some a host of foot soldier, some a host of ships is the most beautiful thing upon the black earth. But I say it is whatever one desires. It is entirely easy to make this intelligible to everyone. For she, Helen, surpassing everyone by far in respect to beauty, leaving she went, sailing to Troy. Not at all did she remember her child, nor her own parents, but blank, Lacuna led her off lightly, now reminds me of Anactoria, who is not here. I would prefer to see her lovely step and the sparkling light on her face than the armed forces of Lydia. So this poem is often considered to be a renunciation of martial aesthetics and therefore indirectly Homeric poetics and a celebration of intimate erotic love. But between the many lacunae and apparently more intentional obfuscations, the relationships between the various terms that are invoked are not always entirely clear. For instance, the poem would more neatly fit a romantic interpretation if auto weren't neuter, if it could be immediately attached to a person. But Sappho keeps it ambiguous, whatever. And when Helen is introduced, one initially assumes that, of course, she is Ta Khalistan, she whose beauty rallied so many dark ships to retrieve her. And the poem seems to point in this direction with Perskethoisa Kalos. But instead, we soon learn that despite her superlative beauty, she has been presented as the subject rather than the object of desire. And what is it that she loves most? Paris, the Trojan prince, is the usual answer to this question. His beauty overwhelmed Helen to the extent that she does the unthinkable, abandoning her progenitors, her child, and with the abandonment of her husband, any chance of a reproductive future. And yet neither Paris nor his beauty are in fact mentioned, at least in the poem as it survives. What is in fact foregrounded and eroticized in the Hellam exemplum is the moment of escape. The first word of the third stanza is kalapois, deserting. The first letters of the participle kal recall the call of kalos, beauty. Maybe what is ta kalasan to Helen is not Alexander, but leaving, movement, freedom from patriarchal family structures, from expectations of fealty and the tethers of heteroreproductivity. In Helen's fragmented escape, there is a lightness, kufos, a hopefulness. Like Helen, Anactoria is all of lightness and movement. In just a few words, she is both present and achingly absent. Perhaps she too loves leaving. But here it is clear that what we are concerned with is Sappho's desire. And structurally, Anactoria is to Sappho as freedom and escape is to Helen, a line of flight. While for Helen there is freedom in forgetting, the possibility of Sappho's freedom lies in her remembering. It soon becomes clear that the poem's primary project, the thing that Sappho wants to make understandable, is not so much the banal observation that people like what they like. It is an attempt to fashion, that is, poiesai, as she writes in line 5, and to make understood to others the feeling evoked by her lover's present absence. The parallel emphasizes that Sappho's state is not simply one of tragic longing for an unobtainable past, but that it is struck through with a hazy, conditional, hopeful future. Anactoria is gone now, but she may return. And in her return, Sappho may find the lightness and freedom that Helen enjoyed so long ago. The poem is a densely woven swirl of time, longing, lust, materiality, and spectrality, an attempt to make understood a subversive type of desire. And in this heady stew, it seems to prefigure many of the dynamics of contemporary studies in queer time. We cannot ignore, of course, the fragmentation of the poem. One could easily object to the reading I offered above by arguing that, for example, Paris and his overwhelming beauty may be lurking somewhere in the fourth stanza's lacuna. But I take this hermeneutic liberty purposefully. Fragmentation is an opportunity. It lends itself to non-hierarchical queer modes of reception, work that is free from a patriarchal anxiety of influence, a concern with honoring a monumental father. Instead, inviting a cooperative, collaborative mode, a feeling of potential and intimate immediacy. Furthermore, fragmentation emphasizes the text's materiality. I mean, of course, all ancient texts, even those transmitted intact through manuscripts, of course, have a long and rich material history. But fragmentation, by means of its striking absences, brings the corporeality of what remains into clearer focus. And indeed, the lacunae in Sappho's poems have behaved like empty shelves in an archive, enticing artists to fill them. The amalgam that results, consisting of the poems themselves, along with the many accretions that have accumulated around them over the millennia, I think accords well with Anne Chetkovich's description of the queer archive in her book, Archive of Feeling, a collection composed of material practices that challenge traditional conceptions of history and understand the quest for history as a psychic need rather than a science. But following that digression, I want to return us again to the Lesbian Her Story archives in Brooklyn and note that one of the concerns of the founders of the archive was about how to do justice to the lesbians of the past, not of antiquity, but of the generation before them, the lesbians of the 50s. And this is from their newsletter in 1981. If we ask decorous questions of history, we will get a genteel history. If we assume that because sex was a secret, it did not exist, we will get a sexless history. If we assume that in periods of oppression, lesbians lost their autonomy and acted as victims only, we destroy not only history, but lives. We were part of a community that took care of itself, and most of all, we were lesbian women revolutionizing each of these terms. We create history as much as we discover it. What we call history becomes history. And since this is a naming time, we must be on guard against our own class prejudices and discomforts. If close friends and devoted companions are to be part of lesbian history, so must be also the lesbians of the 50s, who left no doubt about their sexuality and their courage. So as the early days of the LHA was concerning itself with how to relate to an earlier generation with different ways of self-identifying and different codes of conduct, many queer people today are grappling with how to feel about the lesbianism of the second wave. On the one hand, nostalgia is high. Artists have been reprinting t-shirts from the Lesbian Her Story archives to great demand. A queer dating app modeled on the text-only personal ads that used to appear in the back of alt weeklies seems to be flourishing. And to be fair to the archive and its administrators, the LHA has admirably sought to adapt to changing times to remain fresh and vibrant institution. One that, for example, now is open to people of any gender identity, while its founding charter limited access to women only. But the place can still feel like a relic of a certain era of lesbian feminism, one characterized by the mutually reinforcing ideals of separatism and essentialism. That is, a utopian fervor for a woman-only existence, wherein woman is narrowly defined as one who is identified at birth and lived their entire lives publicly as women. I should note that, of course, trans-exclusionary feminism, as it calls itself, is not just a relic of the past, but a cancer that's continued to metastasize in the growing but still partial effort to include and protect the rights and safety of trans people. So I want to move on to an example of a piece that pays homage to the power and beauty of this moment in queer history while eschewing simple identification or imitation that manages to be simultaneously reverent and irreverent. This installation by Canadian artist Alison Mitchell was put on display at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto in 2010. It's called The Girl's Journey to the Well of Forbidden Knowledge. The walls of the gallery are covered with artistic renditions of the shelves of the Lesbian Her Story archives. Though she worked from photographs of the shelves, the lovingly detailed hand-drawn illustrations evoke the effective power of the place in a way that no photo could. Mirroring the acts of labor and desire described by Anne Campbell in her Archivist Fingers, while paying homage to the authors and radical book publishers who brought these works to life. The walls are covered in gold and silver, washed over with lavender, and graced with a pattern that could be interpreted as geological strata, wood grain, or labia. Two figures stand in the middle of the gallery, one glowing silver and the other gold, hands clasped as they gaze at the shelves. You can see the cats at their feet, a seeming nod to the stereotypical cat lady. Alison Mitchell really loves leaning into stereotypes. And there's also this giant crocheted brain that's hovering shared above them. And there are cords connecting to each of their crotches. One of them is burning Jansen's History of Art, and the other offers Chetkovich's Archive of Feelings to the viewer. So note that though Mitchell does not, she doesn't aim to reproduce here, she edits into the archive. As a Canadian, she interpolates lesbian Canadian literature onto the shelves. In a later homage to Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, she adds a shelf of the theorist's books. The archive is not it's archived not as monument or monolith, but as a living space. It's also important to note that everything in the display is larger than life. The statues, the bookshelves, all kind of lending the sense of awe. And published alongside a survey of the exhibition in GLQ is a document by Mitchell called Deep Les I Statement. So here are some excerpts. Deep Les is an experiment, a process, an aesthetic, and a blend of theory and practice. Deep Les is right this minute, and it is rooted in herstories and theories that came before. It is taking the most relevant and capable ideas and using them as tools to create new ways of thinking, while still clinging to more radical politics that have already happened, but definitely aren't over yet. Part of the deep of Deep Les is about commitment, staying power, and significance. Part of the deep of Deep Les is about philosophies and theories, as in, wow, man, that's deep. Deep Les uses cafeteria-style mixings of craft, context, food, direct action, and human connections to maintain radical dyke politics and resistance strategies. Part quilting bee, part public relations campaign, and part Molotov cocktail, Deep Les seeks to map out the connections between the second wave feminisms that have sustained radical lesbian politics and the current third wave and now fourth wave feminisms that look to take apart the foundation on which those politics were built. Deep Les is meant to be a macrame conceptual tangle for people to work through how they integrate art into their politics, how they live their lives, and how they get fired up about ideas. Deep Les is not meant to become its own dogma, but to encourage thinking about new strategic positions. Every Deep Les moment is different because it is contingent on the contributions and participations of many, and because it is accumulating and discarding as it goes. So Mitchell's approach to the Herstory archive is in sympathy with the way that she approaches, appropriates, and reconsiders lesbian pasts more broadly speaking, in particular the good and the bad of second wave feminism, a way of relating to, elevating, and celebrating kinship with a material past that is not overly essentializing and positivist, leading to a lesbian identity that defines itself with rather than against trans lesbians. I think this is helpful for thinking about the way we relate to antiquity, broadly speaking, but also the way we think about Sappho as a lesbian more particularly. So this is not a manifesto or I statement of my own, but sort of a quick provisional sense of what I think should characterize the type of intervention that I'm imagining. So a deep Les philology would be open, ethical, non-proprietary, product of collective work. It does not foreclose identification. It resists positivism. It seeks truth, embraces maximalism, so stacking interpretations rather than aiming for a single one. And at the same time, it's not precious, so it discards interpretations that have outlived their usefulness, finds a way of responding to, representing, or acknowledging a text's affective excesses, and it celebrates bodies as a site of sensing and feeling, a locus of interpretation conditioned by its individual experience, a means of connection with others while resisting faux scientism that attempts to categorize them. Okay, so now I'm going to discuss briefly, and I'll try to be quick, 4 interventions that each display some of these characteristics, 3 of them quite recent, 1 of them much less so. And this isn't exactly reception for reception's sake. I think that reception is a really interesting way to sort of suss out the kind of powers and energies that a text has today. And so each of these sort of interventions has something interesting to offer. All of them in some manner are, I argue, an attempt to fashion a body for Sappho, to capture and materialize the affective energies that vibrate through the fragments. So the first is this Sappho Punk by J.J. Hostain. It's a little prose poem novella subtitled How Sappho Almost Became a Stone Femme, a fiction in honor of otherness, an experiment in dignity, or Sappho's queer biography. And what's interesting to me about this piece is that it constitutes a queer reclamation of many of the gestures that I've argued in various places were incorporated into ancient testimonia about Sappho's life as precisely de-queering gestures. So in Hostain's telling, Sappho does indeed have a husband named Cercolas. She runs a school for initiates. She falls in love with somebody named Phaon, and not long after she falls off of a cliff. But here, the pulsating and honey-saturated eroticism of Sappho's academy is far more profound than what any of them will experience with their husbands. It is a subversive institution rather than one that serves the status quo. And Phaon, rather than being a beautiful ferryman, is a striking genderqueer initiate who allows Sappho to transcend her relationship with Aphrodite. Phaon leaves and leaves her a letter, the presentation of which is punctuated by collaged images, like the ones here. So a way of expressing the kind of affective excesses that the already adventurous use of language in the piece can't quite contain. So again, here, hands come up a lot. And the book is also kind of a vehicle for the fragments. So there's underlying bits of Sappho's poetry kind of woven in throughout the prose. So it's simultaneously an act of transmission and a queering of the tradition, a sort of overcorrection of the violence that Welcker did, kind of interpreting the same texts. Moving on now to the next intervention. So this is a 2016 limited edition. It's only 426 copies of this were produced. Version of the fragments of Sappho, produced by Arion Press with prints by Julie Méritu. So by way of brief introduction, Méritu is a high-profile lesbian contemporary artist who was born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, moved to the United States as a child. She's typically known for her large-scale gestural tangles of lines and shapes, most notably a 20-foot by 80-foot mural in the lobby for the Goldman Sachs building in Manhattan. The poems, in a new translation by John Daly, are framed by all of the paratextual elements expected in a traditional academic volume. And apart from its kind of self-described deluxe production values, that is exactly what the tome is. An Introduction to Sappho and Her Reception History by Paige Dubois is illustrated by recently discovered woodcut prints by Anita Coles Reardon from the 1880s, giving this part of the volume a distinctly retro feel. The essentially complete collection of fragments is regularly punctuated by two-page spreads of Méritu's images, which in their abstract virtuosity seek to elevate the edition and vault it into the bleeding edge of contemporary art. So these are a few of them, and many of them, true to form, feel monumental, even though confined to the pages of a book. Densely scrawled lines convey movement and rhythm, at times seeming almost cartographic, charting courses and energies that radiate with the centrifugal force. The pulsating desire and throbbing potentiality of Sappho's minuscule fragments is translated into an explosive, affective tangle. But some of the images are a bit more intimate. And we get a taste of this in the cover art, suggestive of an urgently scrawled, indecipherable handwritten language, drawing the viewer into a conspiratorial conversation. And these figures occasionally recur throughout. Sometimes the illustrations even kind of verge on the figurative. And it's not clear, there's no indication of whether the prints are kind of intentionally juxtaposed with specific fragments, but this one happens to come right after fragment 16, which I've just argued is kind of all about presence and absence, right? There's this kind of, this is almost sort of a figure you can see, energy rating off of it, but there's this kind of absence in the middle. So on a certain level, we might consider the book to behave as a queer archive in Chetkovich's terms. It's an intertemporal collaborative project, one that moves backwards and forwards through time, an attempt to capture and express, as well as contribute to, both Sappho's poems and the powerful reverberations they've affected throughout the ages. But for all of the wildness and effective power of the images themselves, they're ultimately domesticated within the frame of the book, placed at the end of a linear historical account of Sappho's history, politely interspersed at regular intervals throughout the poems. And the book itself is legitimated by its material conditions and the institutional normative structures of academia and the contemporary art market. The book alone retails for 1,750 American dollars. It can be purchased with a set of 4 additional Méritu prints called the Sapphic Strophes, which brings the total to 11,750 American dollars. I was able to visit the book by appointment in the Rare Books room in the New York Public Library back in the day when we could go places. But with SapphoBot churning out poetry for free and Hastain's book available for Kindle on $2.99 for $2.99, it's hard to see how this edition makes much of an impact outside of rarefied circles. And I'll turn now to another edition of sorts, one that is no more accessible, but that is perhaps more intimate. In the place of any traditional paratextual apparatus to orient the initiate who approaches this project, Sappho's Fragments by the artist Rose Frayne. This is from 1989. A pair of white gloves rests on a billowy bed of white gauze, an intimate invitation to be physically enveloped by the piece. The fabric unfurls not to reveal a bound book, but an assemblage of delicate, rough-edged, handmade pieces of paper, infused with bits of ephemera. A fine silver thread, a piece of grass, a small flower, a feather. Some sheets have Susie Q. Grodin's translations of Sappho's poems engraved with letterpress. But this is not a comprehensive encyclopedia of the fragments. In fact, it lacks most of the greatest hits. We have no number 1, no 16, no 31. It is a personal idiosyncratic curation. And though the piece is not figurative, it is wholly corporeal. Many of the sheets feature a light pink or purple wash, its shape reminiscent in turns of a womb, a vagina, or a bruise. Some sheets are barely able to hold themselves together. Pieces of paper connected with threads, ribbons of mottled gauze, a fabric that functions in the piece as equal parts bandage and boudoir. One is obliged to handle the work delicately. There's a bravery and radical vulnerability in its tenderness. Triangles, rendered both in color and in palimpsest, are a recurring motif. One of them seems to be an amalgam of paper pulp and clippings of bright red human hair, from where on the body it is not clear, a visceral offering. There's a material sensitivity to its indirect responses to the text as well. At one point, the letters "sui" from the famous fragment about the bittersweetness of love peek through one of the paper's orifices. The book, as it were, also asks to be read both forward and backward. When one reaches the end of the pile, another hazy conditional future, with the fragment, "They will remember us later on," I say, you must slowly make your way back to the beginning, replacing each piece until they are restored to order, a queer return. The entire experience is dazzling, a sensation of being transported decades and centuries, while also completely inhabiting one's body in the present moment. A feeling of accidentally intercepting a tender love letter from another dimension and discovering that you, in fact, are the lover intended. There's a real archive of feeling. Finally, and I'll try to be quick here, one more intervention that, like the others, simultaneously transmits and interprets the Sapphic corpus. This piece also lives in a museum. The other one is in the Victoria and Albert Museum library in London. But this one is on display in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. A lot of you probably know this. It's a very famous vase. It also, graces the pages of many textbooks. It's dated to the mid-5th century, ascribed to an artist from the Polygnotus group. And so if you don't know this vase, knowing what we do or don't about the social status of women at this time, it may initially be striking to see a depiction of a woman reading. However, this was not, in fact, an uncommon motif at the time. And interestingly, there are far more extant depictions of those with relatively diminished social status, women, slaves, and young boys, reading than there are of elite men, a phenomenon that has caused some to question the actual contemporary social significance of literacy. But the elements surrounding this woman has characteristics of a type scene. So one woman standing behind her is labeled Nicopolis. The woman just to her right, holding out the lyre, is tagged with the name Callus. And the woman furthest to the right, with her hand kind of draped over Callus's shoulder, is unnamed. All three gaze raptly at the woman. All of the women are draped in these kind of flowing garments, which is not unusual. And these kind of woven crowns are hovering over the scene. And also on the vase, and alas, completely imperceptible here. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get higher quality images, but library access being what it is these days, this is what we're dealing with. But in this kind of triangulated space here, between the woman's face, the scroll, and the cellist lyre, is an inscription reading Sappos, our poet's name in the genitive. I'll return to this genitive and to the broader scene depicted in a moment, but first I want to take a look at the scroll. So what is unusual about this vase, and what is unfortunately impossible to discern from this image, is that the woman at the center of the scene reads from a scroll containing legible Greek, not just dots or nonsense characters. This is the case in similar vases. And so there are kind of two sets of text orthogonally juxtaposed. And you can see here, this is a helpful little chart from a 1922 piece by J.M. Edmonds. He's one of the only people who was trying to argue that this was a fragment of Sappho that we should put in textual editions. But along the sides here, pterianta epea, winged words, right, our kind of famous Homeric formula. And then in the middle, kind of in the text that's being read, theoi, aereon, epeon, archomai. So, and then it kind of trails off into these nonsense news and taus. And so unlike Feria, the winged words, right, very common, there are no instances of epos being modified by this adjective anywhere else in the ancient Greek literary corpus. And as you can see, both sets of the text are obscured, interrupted, and enveloped by Sappho's hands and thumbs. And there's no consensus about how we should interpret the relationship between the phrases, partly because there's a decent chance this little text was just improvised by a particularly literate vase painter, and therefore it hasn't been taken very seriously, with the exception of Edmonds, who I mentioned before, and Yatromanolakis, who has a wonderful discussion of it in his book on the ancient reception of Sappho, called Sappho in the Making. But is winged words written on the outside of the scroll meant to be the title of a collection of which the scroll's depicted contents represent the first poem? On this reading, aereon epeon is a sort of gloss on perianta epea. And this is not a totally absurd thought to consider the congruence between the words Aryan, lofty, and winged, right? Or as Yatromanolakis suggests, is there a tension between them indicated by their orthogonal orientation? So the winged words, the metonymy for Homeric epos, are here relegated to the margins and contrasted with what lies inside the fold. In Homer, words that are winged are words that fly fast and true. They're words that hit their mark. But the adjective aereon would seem to convey a more hazy, ephemeral quality, a seeming reference to the insubstantiality of the world evoked in the poems of Sappho. But again, there's this tension between the embodied presence and absence of antiquity that's invoked with the intrusion of the thumbs, a representation that is grounded in the body while also being open and atmospheric. Furthermore, the archomai, I begin, transcribed here, freezes the scene in an eternally inchoative state. It's this kind of declarative speech act that it seems that the poem is not yet performed. Her mouth is closed. Illustrates the tension between a set text and its activation. And back quickly now to the genitive, the sappos. So it's not terribly unusual, of course, to have a tag inscription in the genitive. The suggestion is that we can understand an elided icon, an image or representation of Sappho. But I do think it's interesting in this context, given the fact that the other named women in the scene are marked in the nominative case. Yatromanolakis suggests that the inscription's proximity to the scroll in a way serves to attribute the text within to Sappho. But it perhaps also folds the entire scene, the women, the lyre, the crowns, the text, the ceramic vase itself, into the idea of Sappho, a presence that exceeds any individual woman or any set of texts. And what does it mean for any of these things to be of Sappho anyway, right? The genitive as a case is oblique, open, and sensuous, graspable, but more than you can grab. And this is just kind of for fun, but this is a sort of partial list of genitives from Smythe, right? And I'm not gonna read through it. But yeah, let me see. Okay, so as I suggested, right, there are kind of more questions at the end than there are answers. And just one thing I want to say before closing is that as I kind of mentioned in my sort of bullet pointed intentions, I really do think that for this work to be effective or important, it has to be kind of collective. It has to be something that is collaborative. But at the same time, that's in tension with something else that I believe that is true, which is that it has to be really personal. And basically, I just want to say that, whatever you have to, any kind of small comments or thoughts or passing fancies that you have to contribute to this could be really helpful in moving it, if it ends up moving in any kind of direction, to move it into some kind of direction. Okay. All right, I'll close there and turn it back over to our moderators.
Thank you so much. That was so wonderful. And I mean, just beautiful. I would say moving as well, like really, really amazing. Thank you so much. I would say maybe we can go for a 5-minute break instead of a 10-minute break, just because there are so many comments in the chat. And I think a lot of people really love this and want to talk about it. So maybe we can go back to discussion in about 5 minutes, if that's okay with everyone. And thank you so much again. This was so wonderful. I cannot wait for a discussion soon. So 5 minutes and then we're back.